The sun dipped low over the rolling plains, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and red, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The wind carried the scent of dust and dry grass, mingled with the faint smoke from distant campfires. At the edge of the small settlement, a lone figure moved with deliberate steps, her boots kicking up the soft soil. She was known simply as the Lone Maid, tough as old leather, with hands calloused from work that would have worn down most, and eyes that had seen more hardship than anyone could imagine. She carried herself with a quiet strength that made people watch and whisper. She had no family, no home, only the will to survive. The settlement itself was a patchwork of weathered wood and stone, built on land that had never been gentle. Families scraped by on what little they could grow or trade, but the Lone Maid had never asked for help, never sought comfort. She was a stranger, a shadow that moved among others but never truly belonged. The men respected her enough to leave her alone, the women admired her from afar, though some envied her independence. She worked for what she earned, fixing fences, carrying water, and tending small jobs, never letting anyone see the scars left by the years. It was during one of those long, dry afternoons that she first noticed him. A widower, Apache by birth, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that held both the weight of loss and the quiet determination of a man used to surviving on his own. His 3 children clung to him like small shadows, their laughter brittle, their trust fragile, shaped by the absence of a mother and the harshness of the world around them. The widower watched her from a distance, noting the way she moved, the way she carried herself without fear, as if the land and all within it had no power to push her down. People in the settlement had already whispered their doubts. How could a man with 3 children, burdened with the responsibility of keeping them fed and safe, possibly take in a stranger? A woman who had known hardship, who had walked alone for so long, who answered only to her own rules. Yet he did not hesitate. The widower approached her the next morning, his presence steady, almost commanding in its simplicity. His voice was low but certain when he spoke, asking her if she would consider helping him manage his household and care for the children. The Lone Maid paused, studying him carefully. She had learned early not to trust words easily, not to let promises mean more than the sweat and effort it would take to fulfill them. She saw the determination in his stance, the quiet plea in the way his children peeked from behind him, curious but wary. There was honesty there, a sincerity forged in the fires of loss, and something else she could not name, something that tugged at the part of her that had been buried under years of solitude. She nodded slowly, agreeing not out of sentiment, but because she recognized a challenge worthy of her strength. Life in the widower's home was not easy, but it was honest. The Lone Maid quickly adapted to the routines, earning the cautious respect of the children who tested her limits in small, persistent ways. They called her by a name that stuck, a name that was both teasing and admiring, a reflection of the way she seemed untouchable yet familiar. She tolerated their curiosity, answered their questions with patience, and in return, they began to trust her presence. The house, once quiet and tense with absence, started to feel alive again. Yet the world outside was never gentle, and the Lone Maid soon realized that survival was never guaranteed, no matter how tough one might be. Rumors of bandits moving along the plains reached the settlement, tales of travelers ambushed and caravans lost to sudden violence. The widower, protective and wary, strengthened the defenses around his home. His children watched as he taught them the ways of alertness, the importance of understanding the land and the people who moved through it. The Lone Maid absorbed it all silently, her instincts sharp, her awareness unyielding. There were nights when the wind howled across the plains, and the Lone Maid sat by the fire, listening to the stories of loss and endurance from the widower. His words were measured, carrying the weight of grief yet also the hope that had not been extinguished. She shared little of her past, only hints, enough to let them know she had walked through fires of her own. The children, wide-eyed and sensitive to the subtleties of the adults, began to see her as more than a helper. They saw a protector, a figure who could stand between them and the dangers of a world that was often cruel. Even with the quiet trust building between them, tension lingered, unspoken yet present. The lone maid knew her place was delicate, that acceptance could shift with a single misstep. The widower, too, felt the weight of responsibility not only for his children, but for the woman who had entered their lives. He admired her toughness, the way she met challenges head-on, yet he also sensed the walls she kept around herself, walls built from years of independence and self-reliance. There was a silent understanding between them, an acknowledgement that both carried scars invisible to the outside world. The first test of their fragile arrangement came sooner than expected. A stranger arrived at the settlement one evening, bringing news that unsettled even the hardened hearts of the community. A nearby ranch had been raided, possessions stolen, and the people responsible had left no trace, only the fear they carried with them. The widower tightened his grip on his children, his eyes meeting the lone maid's with unspoken questions. She felt the tension coil within her, the old instincts sharpening. It was clear that danger was no longer something to hear about from afar, was coming closer, and it would not hesitate to touch their home. Preparations began immediately. The widower worked with what resources he had, fortifying doors, securing tools, and teaching the children to be alert. The lone maid moved with precision, assessing weaknesses, setting traps, and preparing for the possibility of confrontation. Her presence brought a sense of readiness that had been missing, a confidence that bolstered the family's resolve. They were no longer just surviving, they were learning to stand together, to face what came without flinching. Despite the urgency, moments of quiet still emerged, small glimpses of connection that hinted at a life beyond mere survival. The children laughed over chores, teasing each other and occasionally the lone maid, who responded with a mixture of sternness and gentle amusement. The widower observed them, noting how the house began to feel like more than a shelter, more than a collection of walls and roof. It felt like a home, fragile yet enduring. And in the midst of it all, the lone maid began to feel something stirring within her, something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. But the sense of safety was tenuous. Shadows lengthened beyond the settlement, and whispers of trouble grew louder. The lone maid, always attuned to the subtle signs of danger, sensed that the arrival of the stranger was only the beginning. Something larger, something that could not be easily predicted, was moving toward them, drawn perhaps by the presence of the widower and his unusual household. She kept her thoughts to herself, sharing only what was necessary, but her vigilance never wavered. Every creak of the floor, every rustle in the grass, every distant sound carried the weight of potential threat. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky burned with colors of fire and ash, the lone maid stood outside the home, watching the plains stretch endlessly before her. The wind tugged at her hair and clothes, carrying the scent of something unfamiliar yet compelling. She felt the stirrings of change in the air, a force that would challenge everything they had built, everything they had become. She did not know what form it would take, bandits, rival families, the cruelty of chance, but she knew it was coming, and that their toughness, their determination, would be tested like never before. Inside the house, the widower watched his children as they played quietly, unaware of the tension coiling around them. He felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders, a mixture of fear, hope, and determination. And though he did not speak it aloud, he understood that the lone maid was more than a helper. She was the linchpin in their fragile stability, the strength that would hold them together when the storm arrived. As night fell and shadows deepened, the lone maid remained on the porch, her eyes scanning the horizon. She could feel the pulse of the land, the rhythm of the unseen forces that moved through it. Something was coming. Something that would demand more than courage. It would demand everything she had learned to carry alone. And yet, for the first time in years, she did not face it alone. The widower, his children, the small household they were slowly forming, it all rested on her resolve, her grit, and the mysterious bond that was beginning to grow between them. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound that set her senses on edge. The lone maid straightened, her hands brushing the worn leather of her gloves, her eyes narrowing on the distant horizon. Whatever was coming, it would meet them together. And though the night promised uncertainty, danger, and trials yet unseen, she felt a flicker of something new possibility, perhaps even trust. Yet the story was far from settled, and the lone maid knew that the days ahead would test the very limits of their endurance. In that tense, silent moment, as the first stars pricked the dark sky, she whispered to herself, ready for whatever would come, and ready for the world to finally call her by the name that belonged only to her. The next morning, the plains were quiet, but the silence felt heavier than usual, like the land itself was holding its breath. The lone maid moved through the yard, tending to the small garden and feeding the chickens with precision. Each task she performed carried a sharpness born of years spent relying only on herself. The widower appeared at the doorway, watching her with an expression that mixed gratitude and concern. He had come to rely on her not just for work, but for the steadiness she brought to their lives. He knew she was the one who could sense danger before it arrived, and yet there was a part of her he would never fully understand, a part that remained closed, distant, even as she worked alongside him and the children. The children were restless that day, their laughter punctuating the air as they darted between chores and play. They tested her patience with small mischiefs, like hiding her tools or daring one another to sneak up on her. She responded with a mixture of firmness and subtle amusement, letting them see that she was capable of being both strict and kind. Over time, she realized that earning their trust meant more than just doing her work. It meant showing them she could be reliable, that she would not abandon them in fear or weakness, no matter how frightening the world might become. Later that afternoon, the widower called her aside, his face serious. He led her to a small hill at the edge of the property where the wind carried dust in fine waves. "Something isn't right," he said quietly. His eyes scanned the horizon, sharp and wary. "I can feel it in the air. We aren't alone. There's someone or something moving toward us. I don't know what it wants yet, but it's coming this way." His words were calm, but the weight behind them made her chest tighten. She had felt the same tension earlier, a sense of unease that settled in the pit of her stomach. She nodded, not speaking, but listening closely to the subtle sounds around them, the shift of wind through dry grass, the faint crunch of distant footsteps, the way the sun reflected off something metallic in the distance. Her instincts were razor-sharp, and she trusted them more than any warning a stranger might give. The widower studied her reaction carefully. He had seen many face the dangers of the plains and fail, but she seemed to draw strength from the uncertainty, as though the unknown fueled her determination rather than weakening her resolve. As the day stretched on, strange occurrences began to ripple through the settlement. Travelers passing through told of odd shadows glimpsed on ridges, of faint trails where no animal or human could have left them. Livestock were spooked, birds scattered into the sky at the slightest noise, and an eerie hush fell over the open spaces when evening approached. The children sensed the tension too, huddling closer to their father and the lone maid, asking questions they could not fully voice. She answered them simply, never hiding the seriousness of the situation, but never letting their fear dominate her actions. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. The widower spent long hours in thought, pacing the floorboards of his home as the children slept. He considered the lone maid's arrival, the way she had inserted herself seamlessly into their lives, and the undeniable effect she had on the family. Her presence was a shield, a source of calm in the growing storm. Yet he worried about the dangers she could not see, dangers that might find their way through the open plains despite her vigilance. He knew the challenges ahead would require more than strength, They would require trust, ingenuity, and a willingness to face the unknown together. Night fell, and with it came a wind that carried a strange chill. The lone maid remained on watch outside, her eyes adjusting to the darkness, picking out shapes and movements that others would have missed. Her thoughts drifted to her past, to the long years she had walked alone, facing hardships that hardened her resolve and sharpened her instincts. She had survived because she understood the world without illusions, because she trusted only her own abilities. Yet now, with the widower and his children depending on her, she felt an unfamiliar tension, a sense that survival alone was no longer enough. She had to protect more than herself. She had to protect them. In the distance, faint lights flickered, too deliberate to be natural. The lone maid tensed, recognizing the pattern immediately. Someone, or some group, was approaching. She turned back to the house, where the widower had placed lanterns at strategic points, creating a subtle network of light and shadow to give them advantage if trouble came. She began moving quietly, checking doors and windows, ensuring that each point of entry was secure. Her mind worked like a machine, calculating possibilities, anticipating the moves of unknown adversaries. She did not flinch, but a small, familiar thrill ran through her veins, the thrill of being tested, of facing a challenge that could not be ignored. The children stirred inside, awakened by a distant noise that rattled the wooden panels of the house. The widower rose immediately, gathering them close while casting a wary glance at the lone maid. She had already taken her place near the main door, ready to act if necessary. In that moment, there was an unspoken understanding. They were a team, bound not by blood alone, but by the shared need to survive and protect what mattered most. The wind carried another hint of movement, subtle and deliberate, and she knew that whatever was approaching, it was patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of fire from the hearth. The lone maid remained alert, listening, her body coiled like a spring ready to release. Her eyes scanned the horizon for anything that might signal an attack, but nothing came, only the distant outline of hills, shadowed in the faint glow of the moon. She allowed herself a brief exhale, knowing that the danger had not passed, only delayed. Her instincts told her that the true challenge was yet to arrive, something that would test not only their strength, but their ability to trust one another. The widower finally approached her, lowering his voice so the children would not hear. "I don't know what we face," he admitted, "but I know I don't want to face it alone." Neither do the kids. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that resonated deeply within her. She looked at him, saw the lines of grief softened by the responsibility he bore, the quiet determination of a man unwilling to let the world break him completely. She realized that his trust in her was more than reliance. It was an invitation, a recognition that her skills and instincts could become part of something larger than herself. Morning arrived with muted light, the kind that spread slowly across the plains, softening the harsh edges of the land. The lone maid moved among the children, teaching them to carry water carefully, to observe the sky for subtle changes, and to respect the quiet power of the world around them. The widower joined her, guiding them with patience and strength, forming a rhythm that transformed the household into a living organism of preparation and awareness. Every movement had purpose, every action a lesson in survival. They were building resilience, brick by brick, while the shadows beyond the hills waited, unseen and unknown. Rumors continued to swirl through the settlement. Travelers spoke of a group moving through the plains, leaving no trace but the sense of being watched. Whispers of raiders, rival families, or worse, made their way to the widower's home. Each story carried pieces of truth and fiction, and the lone maid sifted through them with a practiced eye, discerning what was likely and what was meant to frighten. She knew that fear could be as dangerous as any weapon, and she worked tirelessly to ensure the children felt secure, even as she prepared them for the reality of the threats approaching. As night fell again, Heavier and darker than the last, the lone maid took her post on the hill, her gaze sweeping the plains with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She could feel the subtle vibrations in the earth, the faint disturbance in the air that told her something was nearing. The widower joined her briefly, standing silently as the wind tugged at his coat, his eyes never leaving the horizon. Together, they waited, the children asleep safely in the house, unaware that the world outside had shifted, that their lives were about to intersect with forces beyond their control. A sudden movement caught her attention, a flash of shadow among the tall grass, too swift for a wandering animal, too deliberate for chance. Her hand went to the strap of her satchel, where she kept a small but reliable weapon, her body tensing in anticipation. The widower noticed her reaction, his own muscles tightening as he stepped slightly forward, ready to defend. They exchanged a glance that said more than words ever could. Whatever came next, they would meet it together. The wind changed again, carrying a faint murmur, like voices speaking too low to understand. The lone maid's heart quickened, her instincts screaming that the moment they had been preparing for had arrived. She had trained herself for decades to face the unknown, yet this felt different, personal, targeted, and deliberate. She felt the pull of the plains, the weight of the open land pressing against her, as if the horizon itself had become a living threat. She knew that what approached would challenge more than their strength. It would test their courage, their ability to trust one another, and the very bonds they were beginning to form. The widower rested a steady hand on her shoulder, a grounding force in the uncertainty. The children stirred in their sleep, sensing without understanding the tension that wrapped around their home. The lone maid exhaled slowly, centering herself, acknowledging the fear but refusing to let it control her. She adjusted her stance, prepared to move at a moment's notice, ready to face the invisible force that drew closer with each heartbeat. The first distant sound reached them, a crunching, deliberate and measured, moving closer through the tall grass. The lone maid's eyes narrowed, her ears tuned to every vibration, every whisper of motion. The widower tightened his grip on his weapon, his breath steady, the children dreaming unaware of the peril waiting just beyond the ridge. Shadows lengthened, and the night seemed to press in around them, hiding what was coming, demanding they remain vigilant. They waited. And in that waiting, the lone maid understood that nothing would be simple. The force approaching would not announce itself, would not show mercy, and would not leave without exacting its due. She could sense it, like a pulse in the ground, a rhythm she could not yet decipher, but knew she must respect. Whatever it was patient, intelligent, and determined to reach them. As the first hint of movement crept closer, a thin line of tension ran through the air, binding the widower, his children, and the lone maid in a fragile web of awareness. The plains held their breath, the stars blinked silently overhead, and the shadow drew nearer, bringing with it the promise of trials the family had not yet imagined. The lone maid's hand rested lightly on the strap of her weapon, her eyes sharp, her mind clear. She would not flinch, she would not hesitate. But even as she prepared, a flicker of doubt passed through her thoughts. Had she ever truly faced something this calculated, this inevitable, this close to breaking everything she had fought to protect? And then, without warning, a low sound rolled across the plain, like the earth itself warning them of what was coming. The lone maid stiffened, the widower shifted beside her, and the children stirred in their dreams. The shadow at last revealed its shape, just enough to confirm the danger, yet remaining distant enough to keep them guessing. The unknown force had arrived, and with it, the first test of their strength, their trust, and the fragile bonds that held them together. The shadow lingered at the edge of the ridge, just beyond the reach of the campfire's light. The lone maid crouched low, her eyes scanning the uneven ground, noting every dip and rise, every tuft of grass that could hide movement. She had faced threats before, but this felt different. It wasn't the reckless attack of desperate bandits or the random cruelty of the plains. This was precise, calculated, as if someone or something knew exactly how to test them. She tightened her grip on the strap of her satchel, feeling the reassuring weight of the tools and weapons she had carried for years. The widower moved beside her, careful not to make a sound that would draw attention. He had taught his children to survive, yes, but he had not taught them to face something they could not see. And tonight, they would need to learn patience as much as courage. His eyes flicked toward the children, asleep behind the safety of their small home. He prayed silently that they would remain unaware of what lurked beyond the ridge, though instinct told him that soon enough, innocence would have to give way to awareness. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint metallic scent, sharp and unfamiliar. The lone maid inhaled slowly, her senses alert, measuring the angle and strength of the breeze. It told her a story she could not yet fully interpret, but it was a warning all the same. She motioned to the widower, pointing toward a narrow ravine not far from the house. "If they move that way," she whispered, "we have the advantage. But they are patient. Don't underestimate them." He nodded, a flicker of admiration in his gaze. He had seen her face challenges that would have broken most men, yet she carried herself as if the world had no power over her. He also knew that admiration would not stop the danger waiting outside. They both understood that survival required not just strength, but anticipation and trust in one another's instincts. Inside the house, the children shifted in their sleep, whispering in dreams. They did not yet know the complexity of the world that pressed in around them, the forces that could strike without warning. The eldest, a boy of 10, had already begun to sense tension in the household, the quiet alertness in the way the lone maid moved, the way their father's voice had taken on a sharper tone in recent days. He had begun to wonder about what was coming, though he lacked the words to express it. The younger girls, oblivious to danger, clung to each other in dreams of comfort and safety, their small bodies curled together under the blankets. As night deepened, movement finally broke the silence. A figure appeared on the ridge, fleeting and careful, its silhouette faint against the backdrop of moonlight. The lone maid held her breath, studying its approach. It was alone, or at least appeared so, but every instinct she possessed screamed that others were nearby, hidden from view. She signaled to the widower, who silently retrieved the rifle resting against the wall. Their eyes met briefly, a silent understanding passing between them. They would not hesitate, yet they could not act recklessly. The figure stopped, crouched in the shallow dip of the terrain, and seemed to scan the settlement below. The wind carried whispers, the faint sound of cloth brushing against brush. The lone maid knew that if they made a sudden move, it would alert anyone else in the area. She stayed low, her mind calculating the possibilities. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were smart. They were patient. And patience meant danger multiplied, because patience allowed time to observe weakness. Suddenly, a soft snap came from the woods behind them, a sound almost indistinguishable from the natural creak of the night. The widower tensed. The lone maid turned her head, eyes narrowing as she caught the movement of another figure stepping into the faint glow of moonlight. They were outnumbered, that much was clear, but the size of the approaching group was uncertain. She counted carefully, relying on the movement, the shifting of shadows, and the angles of light. 3, maybe 4, but she did not assume. Patience demanded caution, not speculation. Inside the house, the eldest child stirred, sensing the tension even in the hushed calm of night. He crept to the window, pressing his small hands to the glass, squinting through the darkness. What he saw made his stomach tighten with unease. Shapes moved in the brush, deliberate and calculating. His father had prepared them, yes, but the boy had not fully understood the lessons until this moment. He stepped back, heart racing, unsure whether to wake his siblings or remain silent, and in that moment he understood that fear was no longer theoretical, it was immediate, pressing, and unavoidable. Outside, the lone maid and the widower shifted closer together, their movements almost choreographed, silent as shadows themselves. She whispered instructions to him, precise and measured, outlining contingencies for an attack. The widower absorbed every word, his mind working quickly, planning defense, escape routes, and ways to protect the children without giving away their position. It was a delicate balance, and one mistake could tip the scale. She had learned long ago that fear was a tool as much as an enemy, and she wielded it with the skill of someone who had faced death too many times to count. Hours passed with no direct confrontation, only the subtle shifts of movement in the brush. The figures out there were testing them, probing for weakness. The lone maid knew that the delay was deliberate, a method to wear down their resolve, to force a misstep. She remained vigilant, unwilling to allow the smallest lapse to betray their presence. She noted the position of every shadow, the faintest break in the wind, the way the moonlight reflected off hidden objects. Every detail mattered, and she catalogued them silently, ready for whatever move came next. In the midst of this tension, small subplots began to emerge. The children, curious and restless, began testing limits inside the house, whispering questions they did not dare fully voice. The eldest asked his father why anyone would want to hurt them, why the plains could not leave them in peace. The widower responded with honesty, careful not to reveal fear, but acknowledging the harshness of the world. He spoke of trust, caution, and strength, of how even the smallest choices could carry great consequences. The lone maid listened from the shadows, impressed by the quiet resilience growing in the boy, the spark of courage that would one day serve him well. Meanwhile, the figures outside were changing positions, moving in a pattern that suggested strategy rather than randomness. The lone maid studied them, trying to discern whether they were bandits, scouts, or something else entirely. Their movements were careful, coordinated, as if they were watching her as closely as she watched them. The wind shifted again, carrying the faintest sound of voices speaking in low tones, words she could not understand. It added to the tension, a reminder that they were not only physically at risk, but that every decision could be observed, anticipated, and countered. The widower broke the silence, speaking quietly but firmly. "We need to consider options beyond the home. They may be testing us, but what if their goal is to draw us out?" The lone maid nodded, understanding immediately. He had the right instincts, but she also knew that the children's safety limited their ability to respond aggressively. Any move outside the house carried risks she could not ignore. She began outlining scenarios, each more complex than the last, weighing the chances of success against the potential cost. Inside, the children were beginning to sense the depth of the threat. The youngest, barely 6, clung to a blanket, whispering questions to herself about why the night felt so alive, so dangerous. The middle child, a girl of 8, peeked out from behind a door, eyes wide with curiosity and fear. The eldest tried to control his nerves, replaying the lessons his father had taught him, but uncertainty gnawed at him. He could sense the silent conversation happening between the lone maid and his father, and though he could not understand the full picture, he felt the tension as keenly as they did. Outside, a faint rustling drew their attention, sharper this time, closer to the ridge. The lone maid shifted slightly, ready to act. She felt the widower tense beside her, hands gripping his rifle with quiet strength. The shadow ahead had not moved, yet the signs were clear. It was deliberate, an approach that tested patience as much as courage. She knew instinctively that the moment of confrontation was drawing near, though she could not yet predict how it would unfold. The wind carried another hint, subtle and almost imperceptible. The lone maid caught it immediately, the faintest metallic sound, the glint of something hard and deliberate. She pointed toward it, whispering instructions to the widower. He adjusted his stance, understanding the silent signal. They would not strike yet. They would wait, watch, and force the other side to reveal more before making a move. It was a game of patience, and she had learned long ago that the first mistake often came from acting too soon. The figures on the ridge were moving again, a slow shift to the left, probing the defenses without revealing intent. The lone maid calculated possibilities, tracing imagined lines in the darkness, considering angles, exits, and vulnerabilities. She could sense the children's growing awareness inside the house, and she felt a protective surge, knowing that this night would test more than just skill. It would test resolve, character, and the bonds forming between them. Hours continued to pass with tension mounting. Every sound, every movement outside became amplified in their minds. The widower whispered plans for potential contingencies, while the lone maid adjusted her own strategies, anticipating the unknown. The children, partially aware of the silent preparation, began to understand the importance of vigilance, courage, and trust. Though they could not see the figures on the ridge clearly, they could feel the presence, the threat, the unseen force that pressed in around them. The night deepened further, and with it came a final shift in the wind, a sound that made even the lone maid pause. There was certainty now, a signal that the unseen observers had made their move, however tentative. She tightened her grip on her satchel, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders, heavier than ever before. The widower adjusted beside her, eyes locked on the ridge, muscles coiled. The children, asleep but not entirely unaware, shifted in their beds, sensing the significance of what was happening. And then, in the stillness of the plains, a low sound rolled across the ground, deliberate and deliberate, hinting at a confrontation yet to come. The lone maid exhaled slowly, steadying herself, knowing that the night's trials had only begun. The figures on the ridge had made their presence known, but their intent remained hidden. The widower's hands rested lightly on his weapon, ready to defend, ready to act. The children, though unaware of the full danger, had begun to feel the weight of the world pressing in. The shadow on the ridge shifted again, revealing just enough to confirm movement without revealing numbers. The lone maid adjusted her stance, muscles taut, mind calculating, senses alive with anticipation. The unknown force was patient, clever, and deliberate, everything she had trained to confront, yet with a layer of unpredictability that made her pulse quicken. The widower met her gaze briefly, a silent communication passing between them. They would face this together, and they would do so without faltering. The night stretched onward, heavy with tension, the plains holding their breath, the stars glinting cold and distant above. Whatever was coming, it would demand all they had to give, all their courage, patience, and skill. And though the lone maid had faced countless dangers in her life, she understood that this night was unlike any before. It was a test not just of strength, but of trust, resolve, and the fragile bonds that had begun to form in the small house on the edge of the settlement. And in that silence, in the tension that coiled around them like a living thing, the lone maid waited, ready, aware that the storm of the unknown had arrived, and that the first moves of its game would shape everything to come. The wind carried a strange chill, one that did not belong to the season, whispering over the plains and rattling the dry grass like the voice of something unseen. The lone maid crouched low, her eyes narrowing as she traced the shadows that shifted with uncanny precision along the ridge. Her senses, honed over years of walking the harsh lands alone, picked up details others would have missed, the faint scrape of a boot against stone, the glint of metal that caught the moonlight, the careful pause before movement, the rhythm of breathing barely audible over the night air. Beside her, the widower shifted slightly, his hand resting on the rifle. He had kept silent for hours, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his focus. The children were asleep, tucked into their small beds, unaware of the approaching danger. Yet their presence pressed heavily on both adults, reminding them that the stakes were higher than survival for themselves. Every sound, every shift in shadow, carried the weight of potential catastrophe. The lone maid inhaled slowly, listening, watching, calculating. Something moved at the far edge of the ridge, a faint, deliberate motion that froze her blood. She recognized the pattern immediately. It wasn't just one person or a careless intruder. It was organized. Someone had studied the settlement, understood its routines, and now was probing for weaknesses. She glanced at the widower, meeting his gaze in silence. No words were needed. They both knew this night would test everything they had built: patience, courage, strategy, and trust. A low whistle came from the ridge, almost imperceptible. The lone maid tensed, realizing it was a signal. Others must be hidden, waiting for the right moment. She counted movements, positions, and estimated numbers, though the darkness made certainty impossible. The wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic tang, a scent she could not identify but recognized as danger. Every instinct screamed that they were being watched, assessed, and tested. Inside, the eldest child stirred, sensing the tension even through sleep. He crept to the window, peering into the darkness. His small hands gripped the frame, and his heart hammered as he caught the movement along the ridge. The shadow shifted closer, deliberate, slow, and measured. Fear pricked at him, but he remembered his father's lessons. Stay calm, observe, anticipate. He stepped back, pressing his hands together, trying to steady his racing pulse. He did not speak, for even whispers could betray their position. The lone maid shifted slightly, whispering to the widower, "They're testing us. They want to see if we'll react. Stay calm. Wait for the right moment. Let them make the mistake." He nodded, tightening his grip on the rifle. Both adults remained perfectly still, as if they had become part of the land itself, merging with the shadows. The tension stretched like a coiled spring, every second amplifying the anticipation of conflict. Then, suddenly, a figure broke from the ridge, sprinting toward the settlement. The rush of movement shattered the fragile stillness. The lone maid reacted instantly, drawing a small pistol from her satchel and aiming with steady precision. The widower positioned himself to cover the children, his hands steady even as adrenaline surged through him. The figure faltered, then recovered, weaving through cover as others emerged from the shadows, their numbers becoming clearer. There were more than they had anticipated. The night erupted into controlled chaos. The lone maid moved with fluid precision, taking positions behind natural cover, her senses extending beyond sight and sound. Each step, each breath was measured, deliberate. The widower acted in concert, his presence steadying the household even as the danger pressed closer. The children were pulled back from windows, reassured with quiet commands, though fear lingered in their eyes. The attackers were skilled, patient, and organized, probing at the defenses while remaining just beyond the edge of certainty. Amid the tension, small subplots began to unfold. The eldest child, watching from a hidden spot, noticed a pattern in the attackers' movements. He whispered to himself, noting the rhythm and spacing, trying to understand what adults only hinted at. The youngest, while frightened, began to mimic the lone maid's instructions in her own way, shifting quietly to help without being seen. The widower observed these small acts, pride mixing with concern. Every member of the household was being drawn into the conflict, their awareness sharpened by necessity. A sudden flash of movement caught the lone maid's attention. One of the intruders tried to flank them, slipping between shadows. She signaled silently to the widower, who moved with swift precision to intercept. The attacker hesitated, then ducked back behind cover, realizing they had underestimated their opponents. She pressed forward, careful not to reveal her full position, forcing the intruders to reveal more about themselves. Each movement, each small engagement, revealed hints of strategy and intelligence in their approach. They were not random raiders, they were calculated, patient, and deliberate. The wind shifted again, carrying faint sounds of low voices. The lone maid's ears picked up words, foreign and sharp, signaling coordination. The attackers were not only skilled, they were communicating, adjusting tactics in real time. She glanced at the widower, his face taut with concentration. "They know we're watching," she whispered. "They're trying to draw us out," he nodded. The plan became clear. Patience, positioning, and observation would be their advantage. They could not act recklessly. Inside, the children remained hidden, but their senses were on high alert. The eldest tried to remain still while his mind worked through what he had observed. The youngest clutched a blanket, mimicking movements she had seen her mother do, trying to understand the tension around her. Even in fear, small sparks of courage appeared, tiny victories against the overwhelming pressure of the night. The lone maid and the widower shifted positions, creating a silent network of observation and response. Every shadow, every slight movement became meaningful. The attackers were patient, and so were they. The tension stretched like taut wire, every sound amplified, every breath a test of endurance. Then came a sudden snap, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking underfoot. The attackers were moving closer, deliberate, their confidence growing as they tested the edges of their opponent's restraint. The lone maid whispered to the widower, pointing toward a shallow depression where they could gain higher ground. "We need the advantage. Let them come closer, and we'll force the first misstep." He followed her lead, moving with fluid precision to cover the children while she took position. The attackers were clever, but every moment they spent testing was also a moment revealing their strategy. A figure emerged from the brush, bold and reckless compared to the others. The lone maid took a steady breath, raised her pistol, and fired. The sound cracked sharply in the night, and the figure faltered, retreating to cover. The others froze, reassessing. Their plan was unraveling. Patience met resistance. The tension thickened, every second heavier than the last. The widower moved with deliberate control, signaling the children to remain calm and hidden, their trust in his steadiness keeping fear at bay. As the night progressed, the skirmish intensified, with probing attacks, calculated retreats, and constant movement. The lone maid's mind raced, analyzing patterns, anticipating the intruder's next moves, and positioning herself to maintain the advantage. The widower reinforced their position, combining physical defense with tactical foresight. The children, observing from safety, absorbed every lesson in courage, vigilance, and unity. Each subtle decision, each controlled reaction, built toward a confrontation that was inevitable. Through the shadows, the attackers began to reveal frustration. They had expected fear, chaos, and disorder. Instead, they found calculated patience, relentless vigilance, and unexpected cunning. The lone maid's eyes flicked to the ridge repeatedly, noting every change in posture, every shift in formation. The night pressed on, the tension near unbearable, the threat looming larger with every passing moment. The eldest child whispered to himself, noting patterns in the intruder's movements. The youngest, inspired by the lone maid's example, mimicked defensive stances while hidden small movements that kept her ready. The widower observed them, a mixture of pride and concern in his eyes. Every member of the household was becoming part of the defense, their survival dependent on calm, observation, and courage. Suddenly, a larger figure appeared, silhouetted against the horizon. The attackers were consolidating, preparing for a decisive move. The lone maid's pulse quickened, her muscles coiled. The widower readied himself, his hand steady on his rifle. The children stirred slightly in their sleep, sensing the change. The tension reached its peak, a heavy weight pressing down as the intruders prepared to strike. The lone maid whispered to the widower, "This is it. They're going to make their move. Stay ready. Watch every angle." "Trust me." He nodded, eyes fixed on the approaching figures. The children, though asleep, seemed to hold their breath as if the night itself were suspended. Every shadow, every faint sound, every flicker of movement became a signal, a clue, a warning. Then came a sudden movement, swift, deliberate and unexpected. The attackers split, testing multiple points at once, forcing the defenders to make rapid decisions. The lone maid's instincts flared, guiding her actions with precision. The widower moved to protect the children while anticipating the intruders' tactics. The night became a theater of shadows, anticipation, and silent calculation. The tension reached a crescendo as the intruders closed in, their purpose clear, their patience exhausted. The lone maid and the widower held their ground, every muscle coiled, every sense alert. The children, though hidden, felt the weight of the moment, understanding that the night would demand courage, strategy, and unity. The wind shifted, carrying distant sounds, signaling the final moves of this silent, deadly game. And in that moment, with the ridge alive with unseen movement, the plains heavy with anticipation, and the night stretching into endless uncertainty, the lone maid understood that everything they had prepared for was about to be tested. The intruders would strike, the defenses would be challenged, and the fragile bonds of trust and courage that had formed in the small household would face their ultimate trial. The tension held, unbroken, a coiled spring waiting for release, the climax of the night approaching with relentless inevitability. The first move came fast, but not as the intruders expected. As they rushed forward from multiple angles, the lone maid shifted with calm precision, drawing them into the narrow stretch of land she had studied all night. The ground there dipped sharply, forcing the attackers to slow, to bunch together. In that single moment of hesitation, the balance changed. What had been a silent hunt turned into a struggle of awareness and resolve. The widower stepped forward beside her, steady and focused, no longer reacting but leading. The noise drew attention from the settlement nearby. Lanterns flickered on in distant homes as neighbors sensed trouble. The attackers realized too late that they were no longer dealing with isolated targets. Their careful plan began to unravel. The lone maid moved with purpose, not driven by rage or fear, but by the need to end the threat without chaos. Her voice cut through the tension, firm and commanding, forcing hesitation where confidence once stood. One by one, the intruders pulled back. They had expected weakness, fear, and panic. Instead, they found resistance shaped by patience and unity. The widower held his ground, guarding his home and children without wavering. The attackers retreated into the darkness, their presence dissolving into the plains as quietly as it had arrived. No victory cry followed, only a heavy silence that slowly softened as the danger passed. Inside the house, the children emerged cautiously. The eldest looked to his father and the lone maid with wide eyes, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. He had seen fear, but he had also seen control. He had learned that strength did not always roar. Sometimes it stood still and waited. The younger ones clung close, shaken but safe. The lone maid knelt before them, speaking softly, grounding them in calm words and steady presence. As dawn crept across the horizon, the plains revealed their quiet again. The wind softened, carrying away the tension that had clung to the land through the night. Neighbors arrived cautiously, offering help, checking for damage, sharing hushed stories. The settlement, once distant and wary, now stood closer together. Word spread quickly that the lone maid and the widower had held their ground, not with recklessness, but with resolve. Later that morning, as sunlight warmed the earth, the widower stood beside the lone maid near the ridge where the danger had first appeared. "You saved us," he said simply. She shook her head. "We saved each other." The word surprised her as much as him. For so long, she had survived alone, trusting no one but herself. Yet here she stood, not as a solitary figure, but as part of something stronger. The children returned to their routine slowly, their laughter tentative at first, then more certain. The eldest asked questions, thoughtful ones, about choices, about fear, about how to know when to stand firm. The lone maid answered honestly, never glorifying the danger, never hiding the truth. The widower listened, realizing that this night had changed more than their sense of safety. It had shaped the children's understanding of courage and trust. Days passed and no shadows returned. The plains remained quiet, but the household had changed. The lone maid no longer slept with one ear open out of habit alone. She slept knowing others watched with her. The widower no longer carried the full weight of protection alone. He shared it, trusted it, respected it. The children began to see the lone maid not just as a protector, but as family. The settlement began to change as well. Neighbors spoke more openly, shared resources, kept watch together. The fear that once isolated them had been replaced by cautious unity. The story of that night spread, not as a tale of violence, but as a reminder that preparation and trust could turn fear aside. The lone maid noticed the way people looked at her now, not with distance or doubt, but with quiet respect. One evening, as the sun dipped low again, the widower invited the lone maid to sit with him on the porch. The children played nearby, their laughter filling the space between words. "You don't have to keep moving," he said carefully. "Not if you don't want to." She looked out over the plains, the land that had shaped her, tested her, hardened her. For the first time, it did not feel like something she needed to outrun. She thought of all the years spent alone, believing strength meant solitude. Now she understood that strength could also mean staying. She nodded slowly. "I think I'd like to stay." The widower smiled, not broadly, but with relief and gratitude. It was not a promise spoken lightly. It was a choice earned through trial and trust. Life settled into a new rhythm. The lone maid took on a steadier role in the household, teaching the children practical skills, patience, and awareness. The widower found himself lighter, no longer burdened by constant vigilance. Together, they created a home shaped not by fear, but by shared effort. The eldest child grew more confident, helping others in the settlement, sharing lessons learned. The younger ones followed, their world no longer defined by absence, but by presence. They called the lone maid by the name they had given her, not as a joke or a test, but as a term of affection. She accepted it fully now, no longer resisting the closeness it represented. As seasons changed, the plains remained challenging, but no longer unforgiving. The household endured storms, droughts, and uncertainty, yet faced them together. The lone maid still carried her instincts, her awareness sharp, but they were no longer fueled by isolation. They were guided by purpose. One quiet night, long after the memory of danger had faded into story, the lone maid stood once more at the edge of the land. The wind brushed past her, familiar and calm. She realized that the plains had not changed. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a protector, a teacher, and part of a family that had chosen her as much as she had chosen them. Behind her, the house glowed warmly, light spilling from the windows, carrying sounds of laughter and life. She turned back, stepping into that light without hesitation. The world beyond the ridge no longer felt like a threat waiting to strike. It felt like a place to be met with steady eyes and open hands. And so the lone maid, once known only for her toughness, found something stronger than solitude. She found belonging. The widower found partnership. The children found security. The plains remained vast and uncertain, but the home they built stood firm, shaped by courage, trust, and the quiet power of choosing to stand together.